Welcome to a podcast from the 43rd Annual Conference of the National Center for the Study of Collective Bargaining in Higher Education and the Professions at Hunter College. The conference took place on April 3rd, 4th, and 5th of 2016 at the CUNY Graduate Center in New York City.
I also want to say why I think this meeting is important and why I'm so happy to be here. I was here a few years ago, but missed the past few. This year, I moderated a session at EDUCAUSE in which I moderated 3 distinguished administrators throughout the session talking about the faculty should do X or the faculty do Y when they should be doing Z. And I asked, after they made their presentations, I said, is there anyone in this room who actually has taught a class in the last 5 years? And not a hand went up. Likewise, I attend disciplinary and union meetings where distinguished panels of professors will discuss the various ways that administrators are engaged in malfeasance, disrespect, and other crimes against humanity. And I am sometimes tempted to say, is there an administrator in the room? And I think that having both groups together in the same room, as we do have represented, we have a longtime faculty union advocate seated next to 2 administrators, and they've all been getting along. And I think it's really important, given the challenges in higher ed, that people actually be in the same room with one another. I didn't even, have a hope necessarily for pure consensus, but the only way you'll get there is by talking to one another and being in the same place. And so I think that makes this a very important meeting and organization. So I want to give a brief overview to what I see in terms of shared governance from a journalist perspective, and then turn it over to our panel. So one of the big news stories of the year that got inside higher ed probably more traffic than any other controversy this year was the drowning bunnies at Mount St. Mary's University story. And for those of you who missed it, president, now the ex-president of Mount St. Mary's University, wanted to do some things to encourage a lot of students who might drop out to do so very early in their careers in the first few weeks before he would have to report them as students to iPads and have their subsequent dropout be seen as a non-completion. Many faculty members opposed this, and he told the faculty members famously that they needed to view at-risk students not as cuddly bunnies, but as bunnies to be drowned or killed with a Glock. Now, that sort of set things off there, and now we are at a point a few months later where that president is now an ex-president. The faculty opposed his plans throughout, so many people are calling this a victory for shared governance, that a president who had plans that he didn't consult with or agree with the faculty is ousted. I would say you should be careful if you are a fan of shared governance before drawing that conclusion. I think he was ousted in large part because of his inflammatory rhetoric. And that while faculty groups were outraged by the way he ignored his faculty and fired faculty members who disagreed with him, had he not talked about drowning bunnies, but talked instead about, in challenging economic times for higher education, we need to explore new models of teaching and learning. Perhaps you've heard something like that before. He probably would still be president. And in fact, as Mount St. Mary's was going on, there was also a very interesting controversy going on at Suffolk University in Boston, where the faculty were championing a president, Margaret McKenna, who the board was trying to get rid of. And in fact, the reason the faculty liked her, or one of the reasons the faculty liked her, is that she actually consulted with them. And that is apparently a new thing in recent years at Suffolk University. They didn't always agree with her, but they said they really liked her because she would meet with them, listen to them, explain when she disagreed with them. And so when the board didn't like her, apparently in part because she consulted with students and faculty members, the faculty went to bat for her. And I think that's an important example as well, because many people think of fights over shared governance as faculty wanting to get rid of a president. In fact, in many cases, or in some cases, it's faculty wanting the president to stay because the president is committed to shared governance, and the party with power, in this case, was the Board of Trustees. And while faculty and student protests got Margaret McKenna another year, she is in fact going to leave. And then you look at all the other issues in higher ed. We write constantly about institutions these days where programs are being cut and faculty are saying we weren't asked why, but presidents are saying the faculty are unrealistic about the financial pressures on the institution, and everyone's finger pointing. You see a lot of end runs around shared governance. So for example, many institutions these days are saying that, well, if it's an online program, it doesn't have to go through faculty review. Or if it's a program in China or Dubai, obviously the faculty senate doesn't need to approve it. These are special circumstances. And then you take long-standing things like, does anyone believe that shared governance applies to institutions' decision-making on athletics? I mean, it's just taken for granted that faculty don't have that much of a say. Then you throw in other big changes and challenges, I think, to shared governance going ahead. One is the increasing reliance on adjuncts, many of whom do not have basic job security rights, let alone salary and benefits, but I'll focus on job security in terms of how it affects faculty governance. I think shared governance was premised on the assumption of a tenure-track faculty and faculty members with job security enough to say, I disagree with whomever. It is very hard for adjuncts to do that, and arguably it is hard for tenure-track faculty members if they represent only a small minority of the faculty as a whole to always speak for adjuncts. And then you have what in the introduction you heard reference to the NLRB reviewing and issuing new guidelines on the yeshiva decision. And what's interesting to me about that is if you read yeshiva and the description of the powers that the yeshiva university faculty had at the time that the Supreme Court ruled, there are a lot of private colleges that don't look anything like that. And so even though I know many union advocates would say yeshiva was decided incorrectly, if you take that standard, which may have been once the norm for private higher education, there are a lot of colleges that don't come close to meeting it. So we're in a period of a lot of developments that erode faculty rights. I also think from talking to presidents and administrators that there are challenges for them on shared governance. A regular complaint that I hear from them, always off the record, is that they feel that faculty members don't do their homework on the numbers, and that faculty members who are shouting about X number of programs being eliminated because of a 30% budget cut don't realize it's actually a 15% budget cut. And I think these days a sort of a price of participation at many institutions is knowing the numbers. And then there's the question of how it works. I had a president tell me, who was involved in a controversy, that if he could give any problem at his campus to a committee, an elected committee of 10 faculty members to figure it out, he would go with a solution. But if asked to go to the faculty senate, he wouldn't. Because he believed that his faculty members, if they studied and engaged in the problem, would come up with a good solution, but he'd lost faith in the Senate infrastructure. Now, I don't know if that's fair or not, but it was a very interesting approach. And so I think we're in a period of time where there are tough economic challenges in higher ed, a lot of political attacks on higher ed, a lot of administrators who frankly don't seem to care that much about shared governance, and also perhaps some legitimate concerns about how it works on both sides. So I think this is a very challenging period for higher education on issues of shared governance. So we're going to start, so we have an excellent panel here, and from my left, and this is the order they're going to speak in, we're going to hear from Larry Gerber, who had long history of leadership in the AAUP. You heard reference to his book. He also taught history at Auburn University for many years. Then to his left, we have Barbara Lee, who's Senior Vice President of Academic Affairs at Rutgers University, and also an authority on higher education law, among many other topics. And then to her left, we have Brian Blake, Executive Vice President Provost of Drexel University, which is an interesting university because it's a very entrepreneurial, fast-growing university, and I think there are interesting tensions that can come up in such an environment. So they're going to each talk for about 10 minutes. Then I may engage them in some questions, and then we're going to get you involved, which again gives extra benefit to those who want to come down and sit in the front rows. And when we get to the Q&A, there are mics on either side, and because this session and others are being recorded, we do want you to ask the questions into the mics and to introduce yourselves at that time. So we'll start with Larry.
Thanks, Scott. I also actually, before I start my remarks, wanted to thank the AAUP, with which I no longer hold any positions, but they are helping support me to come so that I could speak at this gathering. And I want to thank Bill for inviting me to come. The title of this session included history, and although I think the panelists and Bill thought that you'd be mainly interested in what's happening now and what's likely to happen in the future, I'm the historian. I'm going to give a little bit of historical background before I offer some thoughts about the problems I see with shared governance, or especially the faculty role in governance in colleges and universities today. One of the main points in my book is that the idea of faculty being principally responsible for academic decision-making is actually not historically been the case through much of the history of American higher education. The title of my book is The Rise and Decline of Faculty Governance, because at least up until the late 19th century, from the founding of Harvard in the 1600s up until the late 1800s, faculty generally played virtually no role in the governance of colleges or the universities which were just developing in the 19th century. Faculty, for the most part early on, were not what we would consider today professionals. They weren't making a lifetime commitment to teaching or research in higher ed, and a lot of them were males who were passing through onto hopefully positions in the ministry, or young men who had gotten a bachelor's degree and taught for a couple of years before going on to something else. And in a situation like that, for a very long stretch of American history, where you had a non-professional group involved in the teaching and actually doing not very much research, it wasn't that surprising that governing boards and presidents of American colleges are the ones that made all the decisions. In fact, it's even quite surprising as to how interventionist governing boards were up until late in the 19th century, even about matters of student discipline and so on. So in my book, the main argument is that the rise of faculty involvement in governance was directly associated with the growing professionalization of American faculty members that really takes off in the late 19th century, and then especially as a 20th century phenomenon. It's only when faculty members became committed to individual disciplines, became committed to a lifelong involvement in college teaching, and for many also becoming involved in research and the production of new knowledge, where they really gained a new identity based on growing expertise, that faculty members use that expertise as the rationale as to why they are the ones that needed to be involved in making decisions about what courses would be offered, who were appropriate colleagues, basically the heart of academic decisions at colleges and universities. Professors said, only we now have the required expertise to make informed decisions. And that's what led slowly, it didn't happen overnight, and it happened first of all in those institutions which were of the greatest prestige in American higher education, where the faculty did have the best training, often became involved in research. It was basically the elite institutions which first developed the idea of, well, we'll call it shared governance, but it's actually faculty responsibility for academic decision-making. And the AAUP itself, formed in 1915, was an expression of growing professionalization and was basically dominated by professors at elite institutions when it was organized. And in fact, full professors who made the greatest claim for we have the greatest expertise to be making these kinds of decisions. Over the course of the 20th century, that claim spread to more and more institutions of higher learning of various types as it became more normal for people to be required to have a PhD to teach at virtually all institutions of higher learning in America. And so it's really not, even until after World War II, that finally what I would describe as a consensus developed over the appropriateness of having faculty, and this is most clearly stated in the 1966 statement on the governance of colleges and universities, which was formulated by the AAUP, the Association of Governing Boards, and ACE, the American Council on Education. The three of them jointly formulated a statement in '66 which specifically said that faculty should have primary responsibility for academic decisions. And that was really, to me, the peak of an agreement, generally speaking, in higher education about the principles of shared governance. It is also right about the same time, in the late 60s and certainly in the 1970s, that collective bargaining came to American higher education and spread pretty rapidly among certain kinds of institutions in the late 60s and especially the 70s. And while in many cases, certainly economic grievances were important to the development of collective bargaining in American higher education, I would argue, and I'm not alone in doing this, that one of the other important motivating forces behind the growth of collective bargaining was that it took place in those institutions where faculty enjoyed the least professional recognition, where they had the least involvement in governance, where they basically were shown the least respect as professionals, and collective bargaining was not only a way of improving their economic situation, but it was also trying to gain the kind of governance rights that faculty at more prestigious institutions, which were typically not organizing into collective bargaining in the late 60s or 70s. And so collective bargaining was, in a way, a means by which faculty could assert their professional prerogatives more effectively than without it. Since the 1970s, however, a number of forces developed almost as soon as there had been a consensus about the legitimacy of the principle of collective bargaining. Forces, especially tied to the economy, began to raise some of the questions that Scott was referring to even today about economic pressures, and also greater centralization of decision-making, multi-campus systems, state legislatures taking a more active role in the governance of their colleges and universities as they were spending so much money on higher education. And from the 1970s, a number of forces pretty quickly developed, which in my view began to undermine what had been a very short-lived consensus about the principles of higher education. And since we're going to be brief, and I'm supposed to stay within 10 minutes, I just want to talk about one aspect of the threat to shared governance, which has really developed since the 1970s and has accelerated. And that's also, Scott made reference to it when you talked about the growing use of non-tenure track, adjunct faculty, faculty on contingent appointments. I think I'll bet a lot of you in the room know that today it's something like 3/4 of the faculty in American higher education, of which there are approximately 1.5 million faculty members today. About 3/4 are actually off the tenure track. And I think that development of the increase, and that's much higher percentage than it was 30 years ago or 40 years ago. And I think that growing use of faculty on contingent appointments, for a variety of reasons, it poses threats to shared governance. Scott has made reference to some of them, but it also is part of a more general process of what I would call deprofessionalization. If governance was directly tied to professionalization of faculty members, the growing insecurity of faculty on contingent appointments, and not only growing insecurity, but the tendency toward unbundling of faculty work. Faculty professionals were responsible in many cases not only for teaching, but many of them were engaged in research. They were engaged as part of their professional responsibilities in governance. So you had a true professional faculty member having a tripartite responsibility of teaching, research for many, not all, but certainly service and or governance for all. With the greater use of non-tenure track faculty on contingent appointments, what's happening is faculty work is being unbundled so that many people on contingent appointments are just told, you are only teaching. We don't care if you do any research, you're not going to be paid for it. We certainly don't expect you to be involved in academic decision-making, and you're not going to be paid for it. And what that is in essence doing, it is deprofessionalizing the faculty, and by breaking up their responsibilities, it's partly undermining the rationale that faculty have expertise that is required to be used in making appropriate decisions as to the future of higher education. So I see a lot of problems. I don't see easy solutions. And since my 10 minutes is up, I don't have time to tell you any solutions at this point. So I'll leave that to my other panelists.
So Barbara, do you have solutions for us?
I never promised solutions. Just a brief comment about my faculty cred. I've been a faculty member at Rutgers for 34 years, and I've only been in this senior administrative role since last July, so I'm still learning my job, and I still feel as if I'm a faculty member, frankly, which occasionally gets me in trouble, but oh well, I have tenure, right? So what I wanted to talk about a bit, I'm also a lawyer, I might as well confess that right away, because you'll figure it out fairly quickly, about some trends I see that are troubling, and they're not just at my institution, they're all over the country, that I think it's hard to think about how shared governance should, and I believe it should, grapple with some of these issues. And the first one that has certainly been an issue at my institution and clearly around the country is the clash between academic freedom, free speech, diversity, and hate speech. We've had a number of incidents just this past academic year at my university. I am proud to say that our president, who has been deluged with emails, phone calls, questions from board members, outraged faculty, outraged students, outraged parents, outraged everybody, has said, we believe in academic freedom, free speech. I don't like some of the things that some of our faculty members have said. In fact, I'm today not going to repeat some of the things our faculty members have said because you would be outraged yourself, I think. But he is standing firm in defending the faculty members' rights to say things even if they are offensive, and believe me, they are, and if they offend many people on our campus. But that takes some backbone. Social media, as you know, has made every tweet and every comment a public event. And we, I think, at my school anyway, need to do a better job with shared governance, figuring out how we as a community are going to respond. Clearly, the president needs to be a leader and defend academic freedom and free speech, but so do the rest of us. And we are not united on my campus with respect to how issues like this should be dealt with. A couple of years ago, Condoleezza Rice was invited to be the commencement speaker, and a group of students and faculty made such a fuss that she withdrew her acceptance of the invitation. And I think that's a shame, not because I agree with her, but because I think she ought to be able to have the right to accept an invitation like that and to say what she thinks and let other people disagree with her if they wish. So I don't think that our shared governance systems, at least where I am, are addressing that problem. And I think we don't need to agree with each other. We just need to figure out a way to disagree in ways that don't cause rifts in our academic community. The second issue, which is a far more legalistic one, is all of the different compliance issues that our faculty members have to deal with that we need to rely on them for. Title IX, for example, you probably know that now pretty much every faculty member on every institution's campus in the entire United States is a responsible employee and must report any information about a possible sexual harassment or sexual assault instance. Many of our faculty feel that they're there to be the student's confidant, that they don't want to play the role of the tattletale, and they look at it precisely that way, and they can get themselves and the institution into a great big legal problem if they do not go along with that. So I'm concerned about how we can use our shared governance systems to get some kind of agreement that even the compliance issues are there, they're not imposed internally, they're exposed externally, and how are we going to manage this requirement in a way where we can still support our students, make them feel that we are there to help them get through maybe a tough situation in their collegiate life, and still make sure that we are doing what, unfortunately, the laws say we have to do. The third area is the whole area of diversity. I am thrilled, and I'm sure you are too, at your institutions that we're a far more diverse university than we've ever been. We're a majority-minority university in New Jersey, and many other public research universities are as well. And that brings its own challenges for shared governance. Nobody agrees with anybody at my institution. And that's okay, because that's what a university is supposed to be about. But there doesn't seem to be a willingness to listen to each other. And that is what troubles me. And we need to figure out better structures for listening to each other, not necessarily agreeing with each other, but respecting each other and making sure that people who may have a different point of view don't get shouted down, don't feel as though they don't have any place where they can go to express their concerns. So those are the things that I worry about. We have actually, to Larry's point about non-tenure track faculty, we have 28 unions at my university. I don't know if that's a record, but I wouldn't be surprised if it were. And 4 of those involve faculty. We have one union for our non-medical faculty. Our Rutgers was founded in 1766 faculty. And then we have a second faculty union for those faculty we acquired when the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey was merged into us a couple of years ago. And then we have a third faculty union for our non-tenure track faculty, and then we have a fourth for our adjuncts. And we've worked hard, particularly with our full-time non-tenure track faculty, to give them career ladders. And they now have the ability to not only to have fairly long-term contracts rather than year-to-year contracts. I believe we can go up to 5 years before renewing. But they have a career ladder. They can be promoted from the instructor level all the way up to a teaching professor level. So there are paths that they can follow. I also would like to tell you that our Senate decided, and our Senate is made up of faculty, students, alumni, and staff, so everybody gets to be in the Senate. Our Senate decided that a faculty member is a faculty member. So any full-time faculty member, whether they're tenure track or non-tenure track, is eligible to represent his or her faculty colleagues in our Senate. And we have a number of non-tenure track faculty members actually representing faculty in our Senate. And also, and I don't know whether, I think this is, well, it's news. I won't characterize it as good or bad. But in some of our schools, the faculty who get the teaching awards are the non-tenure track faculty. Our students are recognizing that our non-tenure track faculty are very gifted and talented teachers, and they're doing a great job, and that's a lesson that those of us who have tenure or are on the tenure track can certainly learn from. So I'll be interested to hear what you folks have to say later on and tremble about Scott's questions for me, but I think I'll turn it over to Brian.
Thank you. Wow, so I guess you've just heard from a historian, a lawyer, and now you have to hear from an engineer. So talking about diversity, and it's I guess to go even further, you look, the historian was able to kind of dictate from memory. The lawyer, I'm looking at her notes, they're like notes and notes on top of notes. And then I guess the engineer has an iPad with notes. So we're all representative of who we are. So just to kind of give you, and I guess as a computer scientist, engineer, I think about everything in terms of structure and process. So it's just a great deal that we had these perspectives, because I think my perspective will be more systems oriented, which I think will be a good complement to what I've heard so far. Just to kind of give you some background, this is actually my 17th year in the faculty. I've actually turned a couple of corners. I was 10 years at Georgetown, ending as department chair, 3 years at Notre Dame as associate dean, 3 years at Miami as dean of the graduate school, and then about 8 months, so I'm about a minute in the job at Drexel as provost. So, and each of those places, they've had different systems around shared governance. I've always been a real fan of shared governance, because I think it's very difficult to make decisions without gathering the different perspectives of all your constituencies. So that's one of the areas that I've focused on through my career, irrespective of what level that I've been in service. So just to give you some insights, I guess from a structural perspective, there's about 3 different models I've seen for shared governance, looking at the types of committees that are there. So I've been in places where there's a very strong faculty senate, where administrators are ex officio, but the major decisions are really handled at the faculty senate level. So that's the major governance structure for the institution, on the academic side. At Drexel, our faculty senate chair is actually a non-tenure track faculty. So I'm gonna be interested to share kind of what that perspective is, and just kind of how it plays in. I think it actually helps the situation a great deal, and kind of how we think about our decisions as we move forward. In other settings, we've had a strong academic council that had administrators leading subcommittees with faculty included, where there was, I guess from that perspective, it seems to be more administrative-led around decision-making. So that's kind of more of the opposite model, where administrators are formed into councils and then faculty are representatives, or the true faculty are representatives. Then finally, you kind of see different models where they're separate. There's a separate academic council, a separate faculty senate, and they intertwine in varying degrees of responsibility. So in all those models, I think you see different perspectives of it. So just kind of for me to go through it, I know we talked about actually sharing threats and kind of what things we may have seen that works best. So I'll offer just a couple of comments before we get into Q&A. Threats I've seen at places that have been very heavily faculty senate is that sometimes you'll find in these situations, there may be an overrepresentation of faculty that are most self-interested, and then an underrepresentation of faculty who are probably most informed. So in those situations, I think it requires a lot more communication outside of the faculty senate model, because I think you need to gather more information, and again, it's very important to share data in those situations. Sometimes, I guess I've seen, would be a threat, is if decisions are informed more by empathy, or by personal feelings or relationships. When that plays in, and again, lack of data can be difficult, because I think sometimes that influences the decisions along a path that may not be as well defined. And then finally, uneven participation. I think end of the year for our faculty senate, and I'm not going to call out any institution, but we get the longest list of decisions, and they're very complex. So what you find is that the very complex decisions that find their way to the end of the meetings are pretty easily to get through. So I think it's uneven in some sense if you're not able to spread those decision-making processes across the entire year in some cases. But I think it's important to kind of maintain the same level of scrutiny for all decisions, irrespective of kind of where it falls in the timeline of the meetings. How does it work best? I actually seen, I think from my perspective, limited as it may be, I think when administrators are representatives on a faculty-led committee, and then administrators have the opportunity to set the agenda, I think that helps. They set the agenda. My time as graduate dean, I was the chair of the graduate council, and I didn't have a vote, but I got the opportunity to set the agenda based on what I was hearing from faculty, and the committee actually would actually filter that. But I think that works out very well, because I think there's some influence in setting the agenda, but I think it's ultimately a faculty sort of a shared governance vote. Finally, I think the shared governance philosophy needs to be more or less replicated at all levels. So if you have a true shared governance in the department, but then not a great structure at the college level, or if your board of trustees has a different model, then no one can be on the same sheet of music. So I think it's really important to set a rubric for how you're going to do shared governance and try to, in some ways, replicate that in sort of a homogeneous environment, irrespective of what unit is actually making decisions. So I think that helps a lot, because then people kind of understand the bigger picture, and they understand, and then there's appreciation for all the levels and working in a similar fashion. So with that, those are just a couple ideas I've had. I think I'm at my 10 minutes at 31% here, so I'm working out well.
Well, thank you. Before I ask panelists some questions, I want to ask the audience some questions, some show of hands questions. How many of you think that shared governance is basically healthy at your institution? Okay, so I'd say a reasonable minority, but not a majority, would be my read. We got the lights in our eyes, so I'm not sure. Is that fair? Okay. So we got a lot of institutions these days where presidents are saying, we need to alter our mission a bit. We're a liberal arts college, but no one likes liberal arts colleges anymore, so we're going to add a bunch of pre-professional programs. Should such a move require the approval of the faculty? Yes, raise your hands. Okay, a solid majority. I half wish I distributed administrator and union badges before, but it's interesting to see. Times are tough. The legislature has gutted our budget, or we had a bad enrollment year, so we need to pick some programs to kill. And we need to do it fast, says the president. Should the faculty control which programs are killed? Okay, I think a slight majority. Now, I want to turn to diversity, an issue that Barbara raised. A strong department has a good track record of hiring outstanding faculty members who are white men. But they don't seem to deviate from that. Is it appropriate for a provost to say, no, you can't hire another white man, you need to diversify your pools, even if that takes power away from the faculty? How many would say yes? Okay, it's interesting because it seems like a majority is pro-faculty governance. We've had several big controversies in recent years, most recently at the University of Missouri, before that at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where administrators either fired or blocked the hiring of somebody without approval of a faculty panel. Do you agree that decisions on hiring and firing of faculty members should rest with faculty departments and committees? How many say yes? Okay. So it's interesting that in this group we don't have complete agreement on everything. And I want to start just by asking Brian a question. I was very intrigued when you said that in faculty governance and in faculty senates, you might have overrepresentation of the self-interested. And I'm wondering if you could give some examples of that.
Yeah, I mean, some of the, I guess I'll tell you what often has happened in my experience in the faculty senate. So the research institution, as I've been in, faculty that are highly engaged in pedagogy or highly engaged in research, oftentimes they don't make the same investment to be involved with faculty senate And then we may have other members that are involved with Faculty Senate who've been involved for a long period of time. So I think the longer you've been engaged in faculty governance, I think there's probably an idea of actually term limits. I think you begin to, it's almost like an administrator starting at the same institution. Over a longer period of time, you begin to kind of get a little bit biased over what you've seen or heard, people you dealt with, you know kind of so much of the background that it might actually influence what your thought process is. So self-interested might be a strong word. I think probably what I was trying to articulate is that I think you don't want to be too overly biased in any particular way, whether it's too far left or too far right. So I think what happens is over time, that body gets so homogeneous in their thinking that sometimes they don't think outside of the box, and decisions that come in that really are outside the box are a bit challenged. So I'm trying to think of a good example from this perspective. This is a pretty good example. So we're trying to start a new program that, and I'm going to tread gingerly here, that span two colleges, and they both had claims to the same space in a sense. And I think the Faculty Senate was really split from both of those two colleges, and the members, over a period of time, it lost, I think, favor towards each other. So the new program would be sort of a windfall for the institution, but we couldn't get those two bodies to come together. And I think if we had a little bit more of a refresh in that space, some of the older issues that spanned, and you could see the relationships. You could see it. When we had the meetings, you could see sort of how they were going back and forth, and it was like not about the new program anymore. It seemed to be more about the people. So I think that's at least one example of where, if you have people that are too ingrained in the past, it's very difficult to move forward.
Really interesting perspective. I want to see if the audience agrees. How many of you, and I don't know if we have anyone from Drexel, so I'm asking about your institution. Does that ring true? Raise your hands if it rings true. So I'd say a minority. Now, another thing that we've run several opinion pieces over the years that say, and I don't know if this is, I haven't ever tried to scientifically prove this, that the physical and biological sciences are less represented in faculty governance than other disciplines. And that skews thinking. We ran a piece not that long ago by somebody saying that science requirements and core curricula aren't as strong as they should be because the scientists don't show up at Faculty Senate meetings. And I'm curious, because big picture what Brian's raising questions about is, are faculty governance bodies broadly representative? And I'm curious, how many of you think your faculty governance, whatever mechanism you have, is broadly representative of your faculty? So a lot, but not all hands were up, and to me that's interesting. Larry?
Well, a comment about who becomes involved in governance. I think part of it is the inculcation of a sense of professionalism going all the way back to graduate school, which doesn't take place. I mean, people are basically taught in graduate school to identify with their discipline, be concerned about a very narrow aspect of what their career is, and I think it's a failure of our graduate education. And you having been a graduate dean, I think that it's not just it's a universal problem that faculty need to become attuned to the notion that they're part of a larger profession. They're not just a chemist or they're not just an engineer.
Right.
And that if they want to have an academic career, it does entail certain kinds of responsibilities. So I think that's a point I would definitely make about that. I think in general, my impression from across the country is that more people from liberal arts or humanities more generally are involved, and that it's engineering and business even more than the biological or natural sciences that are underrepresented, which I think is unfortunate. I do agree that it is best to try to have as broadly representative a body as possible, and that it's not good to have individuals in governance who become kind of like tenured in their governance positions. I'm not for term limits as a strict rule, but I know my own experience. I taught at Auburn. I'm retired now. I taught at Auburn for nearly 30 years, and I chaired my. We have a university senate some time ago, and there's nothing written in our Constitution, but people only served for, you were chair-elect, chair, and then past chair and had a position of responsibility. But nobody ever ran for, tried to run for re-election. I mean, it wasn't an issue. The issue was trying to get people who'd be willing to serve.
Right.
And I think not only is it a matter of inculcation of, sense of professionalism, but it is having institutions which reward that activity and recognize that that's an important activity of professional responsibility, and that meaningful service and governance has to be recognized and rewarded, whether it's by raises or by at least some role in promotion decisions.
Barbara?
Yeah, I would just like to echo what both of my colleagues have said. In 1977, some of you weren't even born yet, when I was collecting data for my PhD dissertation, I did case studies of unionized colleges and universities. And everywhere I went, the people said, the same people are active in the union who are active in the Senate. And that was 40 years ago, almost. And I think it's still true. I think that the people who are engaged in governance tend to participate in whatever way they can. And so you see, at least in my experience, a lot of overlap between the leadership of the Senate and the union, which I think is fascinating.
Well, just to continue Larry's point, we run a lot of career advice columns, like for tenure track but not yet tenured professors. And one of the most common pieces of advice is avoid service at all costs. If you could chair a committee to revolutionize your college's curriculum or win one grant, you go for the grant. And then we run a similar set of pieces about what happens when you win tenure. Well, don't let them suck you into service now if you want to be a full professor. And so I think there is a widespread sense that of the theoretically maybe equal teaching research service, that service is way far behind, and at many institutions, including those that weren't always research universities, that teaching is far behind. And so that research, and particularly research that brings in money, dominates, and that's got to have an impact. I wanted to ask Barbara to just follow up more on the point you raised about diversity as a key issue, and I asked the audience one question, but there are a whole bunch of things that are coming up where, if you look in the last year, there have been student demands at various campuses that new academic programs be created, that new faculty lines be created in certain fields that are broadly in multicultural studies, that certain professors be fired at some institutions, that research priorities favor topics of interest. And a few presidents have said, no, that you're getting into shared governance. And the students have generally answered back and said, well, yeah, but we've been talking about this for 25 years and nothing's happened. And I'm just curious, and it was interesting to me that in an audience that I think leans in favor of faculty rights, judging from various shows of hands, there was willingness for intervention and a search in the spirit of diversity. And so I just wonder if you could talk about how you see the challenge for institutions to become more diverse playing out with commitment to faculty control, particularly of the curriculum and hiring.
And I have how many?
Greatest hits of your thoughts.
Well, I think that most institutions are concerned about the diversity of their faculty and their curricula. At my institution, I think we have done a good job with student diversity. We have not done as well with faculty diversity, and we have some distance to go with diversifying our curriculum. The students, and I can understand why they're impatient. It takes, even if we started today, trying to hire more diverse faculty, which we are, by the way. If any of you are interested, let me know. Even if we started today building new curricula, they will have graduated by the time they see any substantial change at all. And so I can understand the impatience. I have not seen, to be honest with you. Faculty governance groups spend energy or time including students in those discussions or those efforts. We do put students on search committees, but they have a minority voice. We have students on our board of governors and trustees. They don't they have a vote, but there are very few of them. So I don't think the student role in governance, whether it's with respect to diversity or any other important issue, and there are other issues that the students are dealing with, has the force that students would like it to, and that's why I think we're seeing some of the anger that we're seeing on campuses.
And just a related thing, so we've been writing a lot, and others have been paying attention to the University of California, where there seems to be a pattern of faculty committees slapping on the wrist serial sexual harassers as opposed to booting them off campus. And in many cases, these are people who have distinguished scholarly careers and are well respected for their research, but not their ethics, I guess you could say.
That's a good way to put it.
Is that an area where faculty governance moves too slowly, where an administrator should be to say, you hit on 3 graduate students, you're gone. Or 1 graduate student, and you're gone. Because we're talking about cases where they were hitting on graduate students for a career.
Are you looking at me? I was afraid you were.
Yeah, do you think that's an area where but then I'd like to hear from the others as well. Is this an area where it's time for administrators to say enough is enough?
Yes, I do. It's interesting. I was reading William Bowen's book about faculty governance. I've read it a couple times, but I was trying to bone up today in case questions came up about that. And his take is that the faculty senate is so strong at the University of California, particularly at Berkeley, that the administration didn't feel it had the power to take action against, I think it was the dean of the law school, right?
Yeah, most recently, yeah.
Among others. And they just felt that their institutional culture would not allow them to do that. I think if you're it's a moral issue, it's an ethical issue, and it's a legal issue that the administration has the ultimate responsibility to make the decision. They certainly should consult faculty, but they need to make the decision that's best for the institution.
Brian, do you agree?
Yeah, I think, I've been fortunate to be at some places that have been somewhat no nonsense about this in the sense that I think the opposite has happened where administrators have gotten slapped on the wrist for moving too fast. So I think, I guess there's a lot, it intertwines quite a bit. I think there are some legal issues about what you can share and how you can share it. So that offers some challenges, but I think at the end of the day, when I also agree, I think moving administration in some cases should move fast. I think that a constant communication is to the extent it's legal, is also important. But at the end of the day, if there's a threat to our students, from a faculty member or someone in the community, I think we owe it to the community to err on the side of actually protecting them. So. To the extent that shared governance could slow down that process, then I'd be in favor of administration moving more quickly to provide a safe environment.
Larry?
Well, I'm hardly going to defend harassers here and say that they shouldn't be, removed from their positions. But I think the key issue to me would be the guarantee of due process. And I do think there are instances when administrations can be responding to student or parent pressures too fast in a way that they're acting, I think, trying to get rid of somebody improperly. So the key to me is due process. And due process would involve faculty involvement as far as I'm concerned. Whether that means that the last word is not with the administration as opposed to the faculty, the last word obviously is in the end with the administration, but that's my concern, is that there should be agreement. Before you get to these cases, institutions have to have policies which will provide for appropriate speed, but with due process, that are in place before these situations arise.
So I want to invite you to go to the mics and to start audience questions, but while we're doing that, I want to ask one more question of the panel, which is when I talk to presidents about shared governance, especially at campuses where they're being criticized for lack of shared governance, a common answer I hear is, oh, I wish I could do shared governance, but their faculty, they're just too slow. And many faculty members will say, well, you don't know how slow we are because you didn't even ask. But this issue of speed comes up over and over again, like the faculty wouldn't get their acts together in time, is the criticism of the presidents, not all of whom can show that they actually tried. Is there an issue, and you just mentioned speed as well, is there an issue with faculty governance and time to completion of decision making? Does that need to change to strengthen shared governance, or is that just a false excuse by administrators?
Should I go first?
Sure, sure.
I mean, I do think it's, having served as a Senate chair, I do think it's appropriate for faculty, and it was a faculty-dominated Senate, but with administrators and students and others in it. But I do think it's appropriate to be setting up timelines in advance so that action can be taken in an appropriate time frame. So I do think occasionally that is a valid criticism of faculty governance. But I would say this, that a lot of times when administrators make the criticism, well, we want to introduce a new course or we want to change the curriculum and we have to do it really fast, that some of the proposals would be ones that are altering, historic traditions of liberal learning that I don't think should be, gotten rid of because there's been a dip in student attendance in philosophy. I think a university ought to have a philosophy department, and that the idea that, well, we have to get rid of it and we have to make this decision really fast, I think it's actually it can be a good thing to have, in certain kinds of basic decisions, to have a slowness of process to give, full opportunity for a robust discussion about what is really good for the long-term future of an institution, not the short-term bottom line. I'm not saying you ignore the bottom line if you've got financial pressures and you don't have money to support everything and a decision has to be made in a timely way. Okay, set a time frame where decisions have to be made. But I think too often that argument is made in a unjustified way.
Barbara, do you think there's a speed issue, or is that an excuse?
Both. I think there are times when faculty governance groups, the bigger they are, sometimes the slower they are, but there are ways that you can create a structure that can be more nimble. You can have an executive committee that is representative of the constituencies that are in the Senate and explain the concern for speed or promptness or nimbleness or whatever the word of the day is, and have that executive committee act on behalf of the larger committee. We do that from time to time at my institution, and it seems to work quite well.
Brian?
Yeah, I just want to echo Barbara's comments. I think it's open communication. So I'm a huge fan of shared governance because I feel like it keeps me safe in some sense, having that insight. And it's not, it's really the collective wisdom that really gets to the best solutions. So one thing, I meet with our steering committee, our faculty senate, at least once a month, and then I try to meet with the faculty senate chair for lunch. I try at least twice a month to have conversations. I always say, tell me where I'm doing wrong. So, and then I'm thinking about these things in both of those meetings. So when we have to make a quick decision, then it's not the first time that our faculty senate has heard of it. We've kind of already been talking. That conversation started long before. So things move a lot faster when they're not, fresh and when you're really at the tactical decision-making point.
Yes, and actually, if the questioners could introduce themselves before asking their question.
My name is Oscar Harmon. I'm from the University of Connecticut. And I wanted to ask you a question about diversity. That, Gail, I think what you mentioned was that the needle isn't moving on the share of faculty that are of color at our institutions, and also that the share of the students, though, is moving. And looking at IPED's data, that I've seen that sort of borne out, that especially at research universities, especially R1 universities, the faculty share of faculty of color is just not moving. And I was just wondering, what are your thoughts about Why that's not happening, because the data also seem to show that the pool of PhD faculty of color is getting broader. And despite that, we're not seeing that reflected in the number that we're looking for. That's my question.
You talking to me?
Well, the whole panel. I was just using you as saying that your comments are in line with what I'm seeing, what the data show.
Well, I think it depends on the discipline. The pool is getting richer with diverse candidates in certain disciplines, but less so in others. We spend a lot of time on pipeline programs in my institution, trying to get diverse high school students into our into disciplines where they're underrepresented, and then we work with our undergraduates to get them into medical school and into graduate school in areas where diverse individuals are underrepresented. That takes time, and that's what I meant by the students being impatient. They don't want to wait for 7 years until we produce a PhD. The pool is getting better, but it's not getting appreciably better fast enough to satisfy the demand. I mean, we all are competing with each other. We hire fabulous, diverse faculty members, and then a private institution with a bigger endowment hires them away from us. So, you know, we are doing our best. We're investing a lot of money, time, and effort in trying to improve the pipeline. But until that pipeline is more robust, I think we're all still going to be elbowing each other out of the way, trying to go after the same people.
Anyone want to add to that?
I just completely, I would say ditto. I think one of the, it's a challenge. I think we in a research institution, we develop these specialties that in some sense limit our options as far as where faculty come from and where they've studied. So I just think it's something about is you really need to look at climate and look at kind of what your body of knowledge is going to be if you're going to target a more diverse faculty. I've been in great places where we've had great trajectories along these lines, and a lot of it's just trying to establish something about the institution that's moving to attract candidates to come to the institution where I've been serving. So I think part of it is thinking introspectively first and then using that information to share something and to be more effective in recruitment.
Two things that people might want to look at. There is a book out this year called Inside Graduate Admissions, and this is looking at PhD programs, which is actually the part of admissions that faculty have the most control over. And a researcher at the University of Chicago convinced a bunch of top 10 ranked departments to let her watch the admissions process. And what she found is that while diversity was a factor, it was only a factor in the second tier of review. That the first tier was, your pedigree, sort of, do you come from a prestigious undergraduate institution, and do you have a high GRE score? In some cases, astronomically high. And that in picking among those, the faculty committees then factored in diversity, but that their underlying criteria meant they had very few diverse candidates to look at. And these are the top graduate programs, which in turn are the places that a Rutgers or a Drexel or anyone else wants to hire faculty from. So I think that's one area to look at. I also think there's been remarkably little attention to the fact that the Supreme Court, in a matter of weeks, could bar most diversity programs. If you look at all the programs that have been created or pledged in the last 6 months as student protests have gone on, I was looking at the list, it's like, okay, well, that one would be dead, that one would be dead. There's a very good chance that diversity efforts will be changed in ways that faculty have no control over. And a lot of people think that this is going to be a 4-4 tie, but Justice Kagan has recused herself. So this is going to be 4-3, and it might not go the way advocates of diversity want. Yes?
Hi, my name's Liz Coles, and I'm from Eastern Connecticut State University, so you have a right and a left from Connecticut. I want to bring up 2 points that I find rather troubling. First of all, we're seeing the first influx of students who have only existed under No Child Left Behind. I'm deeply concerned because NCLB and my high school friends hate it. That it seems to have squashed a lot of student creativity. But more troubling what I'm finding is, at least especially in Connecticut, we've got the tail wagging the dog, where we are told we have to have outcomes-based assessments, and we need to meet the job requirements of various industries and businesses within the state, with no input from students and/or faculty or administration about this. And I was wondering what the panel's views on both those topics were.
Your turn, Larry.
Well, I think a lot of the bottom line kind of assessments, which can use quantitative measures, about, job prospects or others, are really quite short-sighted, because, and everybody says this, but then they ignore it when legislators are coming up with these guidelines, that the student graduating today is likely to have various career changes over that person's life, and training them for a specific job now is really almost nonsensical given what their future is likely to be. Plus, being a historian coming out of the humanities, which always gets short shrift in these things, I'm thinking the kind of skills that a liberal arts education, at least as a foundation, even for somebody who is in one of the going into a STEM field, is extremely valuable. So again, that kind of skill is not normally considered in these kinds of assessments. So I think the idea of having, people from outside education creating the standards by which education, the quality of students is to be measured, is a mistake, to put it mildly.
Yeah, I would agree. One of the interesting outcomes of increasing the proportion of first-generation students on our campus is that those kids are under an enormous pressure to be successful and get a good job and a good career, because that's why their parents have sacrificed to send them. And I've just finished 9 months in working with a task force of humanities faculty at Rutgers, trying to think about creative ways that we could marry humanities skills with professional school courses or content. And I think we're going to try to do that to help our students who are clearly career-oriented get the kind of skills that you're talking about, the creativity, the analytical thinking, the things that employers want the students to have, so that they it would have lots of good outcomes. It would help the students a lot. It would help enrollments in our humanities courses a lot. And it would make them, the students, I think, better equipped for the career trajectory that you're talking about, not just the first job.
One other issue to consider, we've been talking about shared governance in the context of the campus. There's also shared governance in the context of things like accreditation. And usually if you want to clear a room of faculty members, if you say we need somebody to serve on an accreditation panel, that will send everyone running away. But some of these mandates a lot of the mandates, in fact, are coming from accreditors. And so, in fact, while your administrators may be just being obnoxious when they say we demand learning outcomes, they may, in fact, be operating under direct orders from their accreditors to show learning outcomes. And I find that many times faculty members are not engaged or aware of what their accreditors are requiring, either institutional accrediting or specialized program accrediting. And that's a whole other area where, in theory, faculty members are involved, but I'm not sure if that's really true, and that may be hurting some. At the same time, to get involved in accreditation, is another one of those thankless service tasks for which you don't get any reward. But that's where some of that is coming from.
I mean, as a faculty member, when I was on the steering committee for Auburn's accreditation some more than a decade ago, and also as the head of the governance committee of AAUP, we did a series of articles in Academe about trying to encourage faculty to be more involved in accreditation, both at their own campus level and also to become involved with the accreditors on site team visits, which is, extremely difficult. I mean, to not only to find people who would want to do that, but to get the accrediting agencies to actually follow through on actively seeking faculty to be involved in accreditation. And there have been, in my view, very troubling developments with the accreditors in the last several decades. If you go back, because we did this in AAUP, we were looking at the standards, and I was especially familiar with the standards for SACS, the Southern Accrediting Agency, which affected Auburn. That if you go back 30 years ago, they talked about inputs, and there were references to governance, and that now the accreditors are moving to just focusing on outputs in a way which I think, we don't care if you don't have a library. Did your students get a job? I mean, it's just ridiculous that, some institutions, especially, I can remember when the University of Phoenix was up for an accreditation and had no library of its own and could still be accredited. I mean, that just isn't right as far as I'm concerned.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, Kevin Drum. I'm president of SUNY Broome Community College, and I agree with Brian. I like shared governance because it takes a lot of the onus off of the executive leadership to make all the big decisions. My problem is shared governance throwing big decisions back at the president saying, you make them, we don't want to touch that. Particularly around the hot issues today that you've been talking about. But I guess I've had the good fortune twice of running into issues with accreditation as a new president around shared governance and being told you need to fix shared governance at your institution. I couldn't take any blame because I was new, so I was lucky that way. And we went to great lengths to separate shared governance with a capital S and G from collective bargaining. In both cases, put right in the charter for shared governance cannot touch anything that's in a bargaining contract. Now, you can't tell the unions that they can't go the other way unless you bargain that. And I've found success with that and have not had a lot of overlap between union leadership and shared governance, formal shared governance leadership. And I'm just kind of curious about the perspective, especially based on Scott's comments, because you were kind of absolute when you asked your early questions about should faculty have control of this and should administrators have control of this. And I say yes and yes to a lot of those, not yes to either. But I'm kind of curious about how the experience in separating formal shared governance from the collective bargaining. Your perspective.
So we're running out of time, but brief answers to that question.
I'm adding union experience.
Okay, we try very hard to do that, yes. The president always says he's happy to talk with the union president about stuff, but they can't make any decisions that are terms and conditions of employment. And so he'll be happy to hear what he has to think, but whatever formal thing is going to happen has to happen at the bargaining table.
But it is also the case that you have collective bargaining contracts which write into the contract features of governance.
That's true.
In a way that when I was talking about when collective bargaining was first coming up, and the AAUP was quite, I'm sure a lot of you know, was pretty reluctant initially about collective bargaining because it thought that's not really professional. It changed its tune for a lot of reasons. And one of the things that was an argument that helped convince some AAUP leaders who were more traditionalist was that look at some of the contracts which have been written where you actually have AAUP involved in collective bargaining. They write into the contract guarantees for the governance institutions, which are separate, but they're guaranteed by the contract. So I think they can exist in a very complementary way, side by side.
So just in response, I just have to confess, as a journalist, you want me to be, look for subtlety. I want headlines, but I want to follow through on what I said earlier. I have, for anyone who wants, the Inside Higher Ed Poetry Magnet with higher education words, and there are words for labor and management on this magnet, so I want you to come get one. I want you to grab my card so you can tell me the problems you have when there are news tips and send them my way. I've got pens, and so I want you to come up, say hello, and say hello to members of this wonderful panel, and please join me in thanking them.
This ends a podcast from the 43rd Annual Conference of the National Center for the Study of Collective Bargaining in Higher Education and the Professions at Hunter College in New York City.